The rancher stopped the trade with 3 quiet words, but the girl standing in the window had no idea her life had just been bargained away. Coins clinked against a calloused palm as a horse stamped nervously in the dust outside the saloon. Across the street, Rose Carter pushed a needle through a torn work shirt, unaware that several men had turned to stare at the store window. A wagon wheel creaked. Someone laughed. Then the laughter stopped. By the time she looked up, a stranger in a black hat was already reaching for his wallet, and every face on the street seemed to be watching. What happened next followed her all the way to Cedar Ridge Ranch. If this story pulls you in, let us know where you're watching from. The summer of 1882 settled over Bitter Creek like a heavy blanket. By noon, the dust along Main Street clung to boots and wagon wheels alike. Heat shimmered above the rooftops, and even the stray dogs had given up chasing shadows. Inside the general store, Rose Carter sat near the front window where the light was best. A torn work shirt rested across her lap. Needle in hand, she guided thread through worn fabric with steady fingers. Beside her sat a small tin cup of water and a folded receipt she hoped to collect payment for before sunset. She worked quietly. Quiet had become a habit. Across the street, outside the Broken Spur Saloon, Earl Carter leaned against the hitch rail with a bottle hanging loose from one hand. His shirt was half untucked. His hat sat crooked on his head. The old bay horse tied nearby looked healthier than the man who claimed to own it. "You still owe me," a horse trader said. Earl laughed. "I got something worth more than that horse." The trader squinted. "What would that be?" Earl pointed toward the general store window. "My niece. Reads, sews, keeps books. Hard worker. Better investment than any horse." The trader barked out a laugh. Standing a few feet away, Wyatt Brooks stopped loading feed sacks into his wagon. His eyes moved from Earl to the store window. Rose sat inside, unaware. The trader chuckled. "You drunk, Earl?" "Maybe. Doesn't make me wrong." A few townspeople slowed their steps. Nobody interrupted. Wyatt's jaw tightened. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he stepped forward. "How much does he owe?" The trader named the amount. Wyatt reached into his coat, counted out the money, and pressed it into the man's hand. The trader looked surprised. Earl blinked. The street went quiet. Wyatt turned toward Earl. "Debt's settled." Earl grinned foolishly. "Knew you'd see sense." Wyatt's voice remained calm. "No. I just don't care to watch a fool ruin another life." The smile slipped from Earl's face. Several people stared. Wyatt looked directly at him. "Nobody belongs to anybody." The words carried farther than he intended. Even inside the store, Rose looked up. A few minutes later, she learned everything. Nobody explained it kindly. Nobody softened it. She stood in the tiny room she rented behind the store as evening shadows stretched across the floorboards. Her mother's Bible went into a canvas bag. Then her sewing kit. Then a faded photograph whose edges had nearly worn smooth. That was all. Nothing else seemed worth carrying. When she stepped outside, Wyatt waited beside a wagon loaded with supplies. Hat in hand. Not impatient. Not demanding. Just waiting. The sun was lowering behind the Wyoming hills when the wagon finally rolled out of Bitter Creek. The town slowly disappeared behind them. Neither spoke much. The wheels creaked. The horses pulled steadily. The evening wind carried the smell of sagebrush across the open land. Rose sat stiffly on the wagon seat. She expected questions, instructions, conditions, something. But Wyatt only kept his eyes on the road ahead. Miles passed. The silence felt strange. For years, every favor had come with a price. Every kindness carried a hook hidden somewhere beneath it. Yet this man asked for nothing. As the last rooftops vanished behind a rise in the road, Rose studied his profile in the fading light. He never once looked at her the way other men had. For the first time in years, She found herself wondering not what a man wanted from her, but why he seemed to want nothing at all, and somehow that unsettled her more than anything else. The wagon rolled through the night beneath a sky crowded with stars. They stopped only once. Wyatt watered the horses beside a narrow creek that wound through a stand of cottonwoods. He handed Rose a tin cup of coffee that had long since gone lukewarm. "There's biscuits in the sack if you're hungry." That was all he said. No questions, no demands. When dawn finally spread across the foothills, Cedar Ridge Ranch appeared ahead of them. It sat against the lower slopes of the mountains, weathered and worn but standing firm. A split-rail fence stretched across the pasture. A small barn leaned slightly to one side. The paint on the house had faded years ago beneath Wyoming wind and snow. Rose looked at it quietly. The place wasn't rich, but it looked honest. Wyatt climbed down first. "We're here." The front screen door opened before they reached the porch. An older woman stood there, silver hair pulled back, thin shoulders wrapped in a faded shawl. Martha Brooks. Her eyes moved from Wyatt to Rose. She didn't ask questions. She simply nodded. "You both made good time." Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar, coffee, and wood smoke. Two boys sat at the kitchen table. The older one looked up first. Owen Brooks, 13 years old. Serious eyes, guarded expression. The younger boy nearly tipped his chair backward, trying to see around his brother. Henry Brooks, 8 years old, curious about everything. "This is Miss Carter," Wyatt said. Neither boy answered. Henry smiled. Owen didn't. The silence hung there a moment before Martha broke it. "Breakfast's getting cold." That seemed to settle the matter. After the meal, Wyatt carried Rose's canvas bag down a narrow hallway. He stopped beside a small room, a single bed, a dresser, a wash basin, a window overlooking the pasture. Nothing fancy, nothing borrowed, nothing temporary. "Your room." Rose stepped inside. Wyatt placed a small brass key on the dresser. She looked at it, then at him. "The lock works," he said. "You don't need to worry about anyone coming in." His voice remained calm, matter of fact, as though every woman should expect such a thing, as though safety was ordinary. Then he left and closed the door behind him. Rose stood still for several seconds. The room was quiet. She walked to the door, turned the key. The lock clicked, a tiny sound, barely louder than a whisper, yet it echoed through her chest. For years, doors had been things other people controlled. People entered when they pleased. People decided where she slept. People decided when she left. Now a simple brass key rested in her hand, and for the first time she could choose. She sat on the edge of the bed. The Bible remained in her lap. Outside, she could hear wagon wheels crossing the yard, a hammer striking wood somewhere near the barn. The distant call of cattle. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. By afternoon, she emerged from the room. Martha sat peeling potatoes near the kitchen window. Without looking up, the older woman slid another chair closer. Rose sat. The potatoes disappeared into a bowl between them. Neither woman spoke much. Neither needed to. Near sunset, Henry appeared beside her, then remained there, then followed her to the pantry, then to the porch, then back to the kitchen. Finally, Rose looked down. "Do you always follow people around?" Henry considered the question carefully. "Only the interesting ones." For the first time since leaving Bitter Creek, a small smile touched her face. Across the room, Wyatt noticed. He looked away before she could catch him watching. Owen noticed too. His expression hardened. That evening, after supper, Rose helped wash dishes. Nobody asked her to. She simply did it. When the kitchen finally emptied, Wyatt placed a ledger book on the table. "Your wages." Rose blinked. "My what?" He opened the book. A neat entry appeared beside her name. Board, meals, work, payment, recorded in ink, official, clear. She stared at it. Most people expected labor. Few offered wages. Wyatt closed the book. If you work here, you get paid. Nothing more. No speech, no praise, just fairness. Later that night, while carrying folded feed invoices to the pantry shelf, Rose noticed something odd. The numbers didn't match. One receipt, then another, then three more. Feed deliveries, charges repeated twice, amounts slightly altered, small enough to hide, large enough to matter. She gathered the papers slowly. Outside, the wind brushed against the porch roof. Inside, the house settled into sleep. Rose looked down at the invoices once more. Someone had been cheating Wyatt Brooks. And judging by the stack of records, they'd been doing it for months. She folded the papers carefully and slid them back into place. For now, she said nothing. But she knew she would not forget. Autumn arrived quietly in the foothills. The mornings grew colder first. A thin layer of frost appeared on the pasture grass before sunrise, disappearing beneath the warmth of day. The cottonwoods along the creek turned gold, and every evening the mountains seemed a little closer beneath the clear Wyoming sky. Rose settled into the rhythm of Cedar Ridge Ranch. Before dawn, she lit the kitchen stove. Coffee simmered in a black iron pot. Biscuits baked while the rest of the house slept. She learned that Martha preferred her coffee with a little molasses. Henry liked extra jam when he could get it. Owen always left exactly one biscuit untouched on his plate. Small things. The kind that told a person who belonged where. One evening, Wyatt sat at the kitchen table with a stack of invoices spread before him. A lantern burned low beside his elbow. Rose stood nearby folding clean towels. After several minutes, she finally spoke. "May I see those?" Wyatt looked up. Without hesitation, he slid the papers across the table. Rose studied them carefully. The room grew quiet except for the ticking of the mantel clock. Finally, she pointed to a figure, then another, then a third. "These charges don't match the delivery records." Wyatt frowned. "What do you mean?" She turned several pages. The same feed was billed twice. He leaned closer. For nearly an hour, they worked through the invoices together. When they finished, Wyatt sat back slowly. The supplier had been overcharging him for months, maybe longer. The amount wasn't enough to ruin a ranch, but it was enough to keep one from ever getting ahead. A faint smile touched Wyatt's face. "You caught that?" Rose shrugged lightly. "My mother taught me numbers before she taught me sewing." For a moment, Wyatt simply looked at her, not staring, just seeing. Then he nodded. "Looks like Cedar Ridge owes you." The following week, he rode into town and settled the matter. By the time he returned, the ranch had recovered enough money to repair part of the north fence and replace several broken tools. Word traveled. It always did. People began noticing that Cedar Ridge was improving. The books balanced. The supplies lasted longer. The cattle looked healthier. And naturally, people started asking questions. Not everyone liked the answers. Calvin Reed noticed most of all. The ranch hand had worked for Wyatt for nearly 3 years. He wasn't lazy, but he disliked change. One afternoon, while loading hay beside the barn, Calvin watched Rose crossing the yard carrying a ledger. "Funny how much influence she's got around here." Another hand shrugged. "Seems she's helping." Calvin snorted. "Helping?" His voice carried farther than he intended. "Looks more like Wyatt bought himself a woman." The words spread faster than wildfire in dry grass. Within days, people repeated them in feed stores, churchyards, and barber chairs throughout Bitter Creek. Rose heard them. Wyatt heard them. Neither responded. Life continued. One cold evening, a storm rolled down from the mountains. Dark clouds swallowed the sunset. Rain hammered the ranch roof. Wind rattled shutters. Just after midnight, Henry burst into the hallway. "The creek's rising!" Lanterns flared to life. Wyatt was already pulling on his coat. Several calves had become trapped near the lower pasture. Without hesitation, Rose grabbed a rain slicker, hanging beside the door. Wyatt looked surprised. "You don't have to come. I'm already awake." That was answer enough. The ride through the storm was miserable. Rain stung their faces. Mud sucked at the horses' hooves. The creek had spilled across part of the pasture by the time they arrived. For nearly an hour, they worked side by side, guiding frightened calves, opening gates, leading animals toward higher ground. By the time they returned, both were soaked through. The storm finally broke just before dawn. Exhausted, Rose sat on the porch steps while the first pale sunlight touched the hills. Wyatt handed her a steaming tin cup of coffee. Their fingers nearly touched. Neither pulled away quickly. Neither lingered. For several seconds, they simply sat there watching the sunrise. The ranch looked different somehow. Safer. Warmer. As if they had built something together during the night. Weeks later, Wyatt passed the schoolyard while delivering supplies to town. Children played beneath the cottonwoods. He barely noticed them until a familiar voice drifted across the yard. Henry. The boy sat beside a friend on the fence rail. "She's not my mother," Henry said. Then he smiled. "But she's the reason this place feels like home." Wyatt stopped walking. The words hit him harder than any storm ever had. He stood there in the shadows beside the livery stable and listened. Henry never saw him. Rose never heard it. But Wyatt carried those words home. And that evening, while Rose read quietly beside the kitchen lamp and Henry dozed in a chair nearby, Wyatt found himself watching the room in silence. For the first time in years, Cedar Ridge no longer felt like a house people merely lived in. It felt like a family beginning to grow. Outside, the first posters for the annual Bitter Creek Fair fluttered against the general store wall. And before autumn ended, Wyatt Brooks would ask Rose Carter something he had never asked any woman before. The fair arrived beneath a bright October sky. Wagons crowded every road leading into town. Families came down from the hills. Ranchers rode in from distant valleys. The smell of roasting corn drifted through the air, while fiddles played somewhere near the livestock pens. Rose stood before the small mirror in her room, holding a blue dress against herself. The fabric wasn't expensive. She had bought it months earlier and saved it carefully. Every stitch had passed through her own hands. When she stepped onto the porch, Henry's eyes widened. "You look like somebody from a storybook." Rose laughed softly. "Then it's a good thing this is real life." Henry grinned. Even Owen seemed unable to hide his approval. Only Wyatt remained quiet. For a moment his gaze lingered before he looked away and adjusted the wagon harness. "Ready?" Rose nodded. The ride into Bitter Creek felt different from the day she had left it. Then she had ridden beside a stranger. Now she rode beside someone whose habits she knew. Someone whose coffee cup always sat in the same place. Someone who checked every gate twice before bed. Someone whose silence no longer felt cold. The fairgrounds buzzed with noise. Children chased one another between booths. Farmers argued over livestock prices. Women gathered around quilt displays. For a little while, Rose almost forgot herself. Then she noticed people watching. Not openly, not rudely, but watching all the same. The whispers followed them from one end of the fairgrounds to the other. Rose kept her head high. Wyatt stayed close enough to reach her without appearing protective. The trouble came near the exhibition hall. Judith Langley stood beside several women beneath a striped awning. Her lace gloves looked untouched by work. Her smile carried no warmth. As Rose and Wyatt approached, Judith spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Well now." Conversation slowed. Judith tilted her head. "Looks like Wyatt finally brought the girl he paid for." Silence spread outward like ripples across water. A rancher stopped chewing tobacco. Two merchants looked away. Someone dropped a wooden crate. Rose felt the words land before she fully understood them. The fair seemed to shrink around her. For a second, she stood perfectly still. The old shame returned. The saloon, the bargain, the wagon, every pair of eyes. Judith smiled as though she had won something. Then Wyatt stepped forward. His voice never rose. That somehow made it stronger. The woman standing beside me saved this ranch. No one moved. No one spoke. Wyatt continued. She found mistakes in my accounts nobody else caught. His eyes remained on Judith. She helped save calves during a flood. The crowd grew quieter. She taught my boys things I couldn't. Rose looked at him. He never glanced her way. Every word belonged to the truth. She cared for my mother. Several people lowered their eyes, and she helped turn Cedar Ridge profitable again. The silence deepened. Then Wyatt asked one simple question. And what exactly have you built, Mrs. Langley? Judith opened her mouth. Nothing came out. The crowd waited. Still nothing. A few heads nodded. Someone quietly cleared his throat. The moment had shifted. Everyone felt it. Judith felt it most of all. She looked away first. The fair slowly returned to life. People resumed walking. Voices returned. But they sounded different now. Rose noticed several townsfolk greeting her as they passed. Not out of pity, out of respect. When the sun finally dropped behind the mountains, Wyatt and Rose rode home. The wagon wheels rolled through long shadows. Neither spoke much. The events of the day sat between them. Not heavy, just present. Back at Cedar Ridge Ranch, the porch lantern glowed softly against the darkness. Crickets hummed beyond the fence line. Martha had already gone to bed. The boys were asleep upstairs. Rose sat on the porch steps. Wyatt remained standing near the railing. For several minutes they listened to the wind moving through the cottonwoods. Then Wyatt spoke. You could leave tomorrow if you wanted. Rose turned toward him. The words surprised her. Not because he said them, because he meant them. No conditions, no guilt, no expectations. Just freedom. The same freedom he had given her the day they met. I know, she said quietly. Wyatt nodded. Neither added anything else. The silence that followed felt strangely peaceful. After a while, Wyatt removed his hat and looked toward the dark pasture. There was uncertainty in him now, a rare thing. When he finally spoke again, his voice had changed. Softer. Careful. Rose. She looked up. His hands tightened slightly around the brim of his hat, as though searching for courage. Would you allow me to court you proper? The words settled gently into the night air. Not marry, not possess, not promise things he had not earned. Simply court. Rose stared at him. The question itself left her speechless. Nobody had ever asked what she wanted before. Not Earl, not Bitter Creek, not life itself. For a long moment, neither moved. Then the distant sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the silence. Fast, urgent. A rider appeared at the front gate carrying a lantern. Wyatt straightened. The rider pulled his horse to a stop. Dust swirled around the animal's legs. Mr. Brooks. Wyatt stepped forward. What is it? The rider removed his hat. His face looked troubled. I came from Bitter Creek. Rose felt her stomach tighten. The man looked toward her, then back at Wyatt. Earl Carter's been asking questions. The porch seemed to grow colder. The rider swallowed. He's headed this way. The lantern flame flickered between them, and for the first time in many months, the past had found the road back to Cedar Ridge Ranch. The rider stayed only long enough to deliver the warning. By the time the sound of hoofbeats faded into the darkness, the porch felt different. Colder somehow. Rose stood with her arms folded against the evening chill. Wyatt remained beside the railing. Neither mentioned the question he had asked moments earlier, the one that still hung unfinished between them. Inside the house, a floorboard creaked upstairs, Henry turning over in bed, life continuing. The next morning arrived bright and clear. Frost silvered the pasture grass. Rose carried a bucket of feed toward the chicken coop while trying not to think about Earl Carter. It didn't work. Every familiar task seemed to carry an old memory behind it. A bottle slamming onto a table. Coins disappearing into a gambler's hand. Promises broken before sunset. Martha noticed before anyone else. Late that afternoon, she found Rose mending a torn coat near the kitchen stove. "You don't owe him anything." Rose's needle paused. Martha continued peeling apples. "He may believe otherwise. That doesn't make it true." Neither woman said another word, but the silence felt comforting. 3 days later, Earl arrived. The sound of his horse reached the ranch before noon. Owen spotted him first, a lone rider approaching through a cloud of dust. By the time the horse reached the front gate, Wyatt was already outside. Rose stepped onto the porch. For a moment, she barely recognized the man. Earl looked older, smaller. The whiskey had taken pieces of him. His coat hung loose. His beard had gone gray in places, but his eyes were exactly the same, always searching for something to take. "Well," Earl said, climbing awkwardly from the saddle. "Looks like you're doing mighty fine." His gaze swept across the ranch, the repaired barn, the straight fences, the livestock, the house. He whistled softly. "Seems Wyatt got rich after taking you." Nobody answered. Earl smiled. "Figure I'm owed something." Rose felt Henry move closer beside her. His small hand slipped into hers. A second later, Owen stepped forward too. Not in front of Wyatt. In front of Rose. The gesture was small, yet it changed everything. Earl noticed. His smile faded. "I raised you." "No," Rose said quietly. "You didn't." The wind moved across the pasture. Somewhere near the barn, a gate rattled. Earl shifted uncomfortably. "I gave you a place to stay." "You gave me a roof." Rose stepped off the porch, slowly, calmly. She crossed the yard until only a few feet separated them. Then she reached into her apron pocket. A small leather pouch appeared in her hand. Coins clinked softly inside. Earl frowned. Rose placed the pouch into his palm. Exactly the amount Wyatt had paid to settle the debt. Not 1 cent more. Not 1 cent less. The old man's fingers tightened around it. "What is this? You traded me because you thought I had no value." Her voice never rose. The words didn't need help. "Now we're even." For a long moment, nobody moved. The ranch stood silent around them. Even Earl seemed unable to find an answer. His eyes drifted toward the house, toward Martha, toward the boys, toward Wyatt. Then finally back to Rose. And for the first time, he seemed to understand what had happened, not what he had gained, what he had lost. Without another word, he climbed back into the saddle. The horse turned. The rider disappeared down the same road that had once carried Rose away from Bitter Creek. This time she didn't watch him leave. She simply turned back toward home. Weeks passed. Winter settled across the foothills. Snow gathered along fence posts. Smoke curled from the chimney each morning. Life found its rhythm again. One evening, Wyatt met Rose on the porch as sunset painted the mountains gold. The cold air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke. For a moment they stood together, watching the last light fade. Then Wyatt cleared his throat. There was a trace of nervousness she had never heard before. "Rose." She smiled slightly. "Yes?" His eyes met hers. Steady, honest. The same eyes that had looked at her in Bitter Creek and seen a person instead of a bargain. "May I court you proper?" This time there was no interruption. No rider. No past returning. Only the two of them. Rose felt the corners of her mouth lift, a quiet smile, the kind that starts deep inside. Yes. The answer was barely louder than the wind, but it was enough. A year later, during a wedding celebration filled with laughter, coffee, fiddle music, and neighbors packed shoulder to shoulder beneath strings of lanterns, Deputy Frank Dawson raised a glass. He smiled toward Wyatt. "You know," he said, "most folks never learn the whole story." Rose looked up. Frank chuckled. Wyatt paid Earl's debt that first day knowing he'd never see a penny back. The room grew quiet. Rose turned toward Wyatt. He looked suddenly interested in his coffee cup. Frank laughed. "Never told anybody. Said it wasn't important." A warmth spread through Rose's chest. Not because of the money, because she finally understood. Wyatt hadn't helped her because he loved her. Back then, he didn't even know her. He had simply done what was right. Love had come later, built one quiet day at a time. Years passed. Cedar Ridge Ranch flourished. Children's laughter drifted across the yard. The town no longer whispered when Rose entered a room. People greeted her by name. Above the stable hung the old saddle from the horse that had once symbolized her humiliation. Beneath it, Wyatt carved a wooden plaque with his own hands. The horse brought her here. Her courage built everything after. One summer evening, Rose stood beside him watching the sun sink behind the Wyoming hills. The ranch glowed golden beneath the fading light. A place once filled with loneliness now overflowed with life. Wyatt slipped his hand into hers. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Some stories end with grand declarations. The best ones end with a porch, a family, and the quiet certainty that home has finally been found. And maybe that's why Rose and Wyatt's story lingers long after the last sunset fades over Cedar Ridge Ranch. Because if you place yourself in Rose's boots for a moment, you can almost feel what she felt. Imagine being judged by your worst day. Imagine being treated like a burden. Then meeting someone who sees your worth before you've had the chance to prove it. Not because they expect something in return, but because kindness is simply who they are. In the end, the greatest gift Wyatt gave Rose wasn't a room, a ranch, or even his name. It was the freedom to choose her own future. And the greatest gift Rose gave Wyatt wasn't prosperity or comfort. It was the courage to open a heart that had been closed by grief for far too long. Maybe that's what real love looks like. Not rescue, not perfection. Just two people choosing, day after day, to build something stronger than the pain they came from. I'd love to hear from you. What moment in Rose and Wyatt's journey stayed with you the most? And if stories like this bring you a little peace at the end of a long day, I hope you'll stay a while. There are still more forgotten roads, hidden histories, unlikely friendships, and heartfelt love stories waiting just beyond the next horizon. Whenever you're ready, we'll be here to share another one.